Welcome everybody to this seminar, and I am sorry to say we are now closing up to the end of this conference. This time we will discuss questions about measuring the impact of investigative journalism, and I will introduce to you the moderator from Columbia University, Professor Anja Schifrin.
Thank you all for coming. I know that impact is a subject that all of us have had to become acquainted with over the years. My first foray into impact measurement was in 2014 when I was on the journalism board of Open Society Foundation, and Chris Stone, who was then the president, said, hey, should we be looking at impact of all our grant making? And I wrote with my students a 150-page report for OSF on how to think about impact. And one of the things, and then we started measuring the impact of journalism in different countries. And you know, one of the things we noticed right away is that impact is a big drag for journalists. People want to be doing their reporting, and they don't necessarily want to spend time on measuring what they're doing and having to report to donors or their publishers. So we tried to look at different aspects of the subject, how the economics literature measures impact, how political scientists measure impact, and then in journalism, we have our own ways of measuring impact. So I think probably one of the most important early works was the 1991 book by David Protess, which did case studies and argued that there's three forms of impact. The first is personal, like you do a story and somebody gets fired. The second is deliberative, such as Congress has hearings. And then the third is substantive, where laws or policies change. We've come really a long way since then. And I think that the people on this panel are really at the cutting edge of some of the work on measuring impact. We've got a whole lot of new tools that we didn't have before, and a much more deeper understanding of what impact is, why it matters, how to measure it. In my books, Global Muckraking and Africa Muckraking, we showcased case studies of investigative journalism from the Global South going back 200 years. And we looked at all those stories, trafficking stories in 1870, earthquake stories in 1910. Why did they have impact? And part of that was because there were civil society groups that were campaigning. And all of a sudden, you know, you had Indian anti-colonialists working on women's education, and then the articles in the Bengali paper inspired them. Or when we look at the Nike campaign in Indonesia, there was a labor union that was behind. So one of my arguments is that impact isn't something we do in isolation. It's something that often involves engaging with civil society. And there's, you know, that's at one end, right? The sort of social change aspect. And then at the other is the traffic and the audience behavior and the audience engagement and the revenue. So there's a lot of different ways to talk about impact. And since we have such a strong panel, I'll stop talking right now and introduce our first speaker, Miriam Wells, who will be presenting how she thinks. And she's a genuine impact editor, something that I don't think existed when we all started thinking about this decades ago. Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you, Anja. Hi, everyone. So as Anja said, I am the impact editor at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. We are the largest nonprofit newsroom in the UK. We investigate systemic issues of social injustice and wrongdoing, issues of public interest. And 4 years ago, we created the role of impact editor with a mandate of really maximizing the real-world impact of our journalism. And I really want to stress the word editor in this title. Okay, this is not a role that is sitting outside the journalism, sort of tracking and measuring and just sort of the impact that just happens to occur. This is a role inside the leadership team, inside the senior editorial team, really building a culture and editorial processes that embed these questions of impact and thinking about impact into every stage of our work, from before we may conceive of a project through to when the investigations are, you know, how they are shaped and how they are distributed, and beyond. So although this panel is technically titled Measuring Impact, what I really want to talk about first today, before we get onto the measurement, is making impact. Like, how do we actually actively make it? How do we make more of it? I don't think we talk about this enough. But this inevitably brings us to the first reaction I always get when I talk about actively planning for impact, that hang on, we're journalists, we're not activists, like this is not our job, we don't make change happen, we are here to gather the truth and find the truth and put the truth out there into the world, and what happens with that truth has nothing to do with us, that's going to happen over there, nothing to do with us. So, I mean, to an extent, I do agree with that, it's not our job to make change happen, it's never our role to go out there and try and say this should happen or that should happen. But journalism clearly does play a really important role in change, and honestly, I think to properly serve the public interest, it is our job to think about that and to think about how to play that role really well. We've got 2,000 people here at this conference, all doing investigative journalism. Unless I'm missing something, probably I think no one does investigative journalism unless they think it does something good in the world, right? So let's talk about what that good is and like how we can design it and make it more good and maximize the good that it does. So planning for impact isn't planning for particular change. It's just making sure journalism does its job properly. Don't worry, I'm not going to read out everything on this slide. But talking about how journalism does its job, we're all really happy to say that journalism strengthens democracy, that it holds power to account, that it connects people. Those things are not controversial. So if you just stop to think about how it does that, I'm not going to read all this out, but if you stop to think about it, it will be some version of what's on this slide. As Anya was just saying, the impact from the journalism comes from the people who are going to interact with that, react to that, take the work and use it and do something with it. And if you just spend a little bit of time thinking about how to make the work most useful and how to get it to those people who can really use it in the most useful way at the most useful time, then you can massively amplify, the potential power and the potential reach of your work. So, yeah, impact for me isn't we change this. It is, our work, our journalism was really useful and it was actively used. This is impact. So what does this look like in practice at the Bureau? I kind of divide this into three sort of buckets. There's the behind-the-scenes stuff, what's happening in the organization and in the editorial process. We have impact editor role, we have impact producers and community organizers embedded inside our investigative teams who are part of shaping and delivering the journalism. We build questions of impact into our scoping, into our pitching, into our green light process, into planning how we are going to output and distribute the work. It's a fully embedded part of all of our processes. Secondly, relationships. This is so important, and this again speaks to what Anya was just saying. Journalism doesn't change anything on its own. Like, even when you think that it has, it just never has. It's a really, really important actor in change, but there's many other important actors and events that it needs to come together with. And if you can just build meaningful relationships with those other actors, that's not to say you're sort of collaborating with an NGO, with a particular agenda. It's just say be connected, have relationships so that your work can feed into theirs and vice versa. In that way, everybody's work is strengthened, more impact occurs, greater change happens. And then finally, the part about the work going out there into the world, the audiences and the communities that you want that work to reach. Who needs to see this? Who should be paying attention? Who could benefit from it some way? How are we going to get that? Who are we going to partner with to reach the biggest audience? And then what are we going to do beyond the page, off the page, to reach those audiences that could really benefit from the work in some way who might not see it in the traditional formats? So I'm going to take you through an example of an investigation at the Bureau which kind of highlights this whole process working really well. This was an investigation looking at Deliveroo, a major food delivery app in the UK, delivers takeaway food from restaurants to people's homes. And it operates in a bit like Uber. It has these riders who are working for the company but are not treated as employees. They don't have workers' rights. They're all self-employed. This was an idea that was brought to us by riders to really look at what the average pay was that Deliveroo was giving its riders. They had no idea. They didn't have information about how it was being calculated through the algorithm. We collaborated with them on the investigation itself. We crowdsourced data by getting riders to upload their payslips onto an online tool that was developed by their union. We had a relationship with the union. And we ended up finding that some of them were being paid as little as £2 an hour. And the average pay fell sort of well below minimum wage, legal wages in the UK. So what were we aiming to do that was useful with this investigation? You know, we thought about this from the start. How can this be valuable? How can this be a useful piece of work? And these impact goals that you see here, really thinking about how the investigation could be valuable, helped guide our decision to do it in the first place, but also how we carried out the investigation and how we distributed the findings. So, you know, at that point, there was really no data available at all on how workers in the gig economy were being paid. We wanted to create that data set that people could, you know, all sorts of people could have to use. We wanted to equip riders with that information. That was really important. You know, they had no way of knowing how much they would be paid for a shift. They didn't know how that was calculated because it was done by an algorithm, and they didn't have anything to compare it to. We really wanted to spark a conversation in society about gig economy, workers' rights, and how these companies are operating. Important piece of information is that Deliveroo was set to float on the London Stock Exchange later that year. It was billed to be the sort of biggest flotation ever of a company on the London Stock Exchange. So a really, really key audience for us with this story was the, you know, investors. We wanted to potential investors to have information about Deliveroo's corporate practices ahead of that flotation. So how did we shape the project to deliver on those goals? Thinking about who we collaborated with, who we built relationships with, that was really important. Obviously, the riders and the union. These relationships were really crucial, not just to get the story. You know, we wouldn't have got that data, and we would not have got the human stories. The riders were interviewing, you know, other riders, which was what helped get that story onto a primetime evening news show. So yeah, they were crucial to both getting the data, making the investigation happen, but also to making that work really useful and impactful after it was published. We collaborated with mainstream media outlets. You know, we wanted that mass reach. We wanted to spark a sort of societal conversation. We had ITV, leading broadcaster, and Daily Mirror. It's a big tabloid newspaper in the UK with a sort of strong history of sort of talking about workers' issues. And, you know, we then thought really carefully about specific kind of target audiences. So, as I said, the investors were a really key audience. The riders, the consumers of the food, the people buying the food from Deliveroo, and the restaurants who also have to pay a commission. Every time a rider goes off to deliver the food, they have to pay a commission to Deliveroo. So we designed a package that would reach those audiences in those different ways, in the way that they, you know, in the most useful way for them. So we had the primetime and tabloid news packages. We had local articles in areas where riders around the country had collaborated with us. We built a message that consumers could paste into their Deliveroo app to reach kind of riders that might not have, you know, participated in the investigation or know about it. So, you know, the link to the story. We did a financial press release. This was really key. We had sort of built a press release tailored to our financial audience and sent that to financial outlets across the world. And the same with the catering trade press in the food retail industry. And there's a really famous footballer in the UK, Marcus Rashford. He campaigns on child food poverty, and Deliveroo was one of the corporate sponsors of his initiative. So we also made contact with him to tell him about the findings. So what were the results? Well, it was great. You know, this really did go around the world. You know, we had more than 250 outlets around the world in the end, you know, ranging from, you know, the big hitters like, you know, Bloomberg, Yahoo, AP. We obviously had our major outlets in the UK as well. Across the financial press, you know, it really went everywhere. And we had a big piece in the Financial Times, which is, you know, really influential international financial newspaper. And lots and lots of catering and food press, and even something in a football magazine, which was great. You know, you don't normally get investigative journalism necessarily to like in a football magazine. We had 6 major investment firms pull out of the IPO ahead of the flotation, stating concerns about workers' rights. It doesn't say this on the slide, but $2 billion was wiped off the share price, and it ended up being the worst flotation of a company on the London Stock Exchange, the worst opening day of a company on the London Stock Exchange in history. We had really high-profile political response. We had, you know, MPs, ministers, MPs saying, you know, we've got to talk about the gig economy. This is not okay. Marcus Rashford held talks with Deliveroo management. The union's campaign, which was obviously going on prior to this and subsequent to this, was really bolstered. You know, they had data they could use. And most actually meaningfully for me, what I really love about this is that one of the riders, you know, after taking part in this, decided he wanted to become a journalist. And I want to just like end on this because, you know, there's so many, we talk about high-profile political response, institutional stuff, but so you can have that, some of the most meaningful impact you can have and is through, you know, have a meaningful, profound impact on a human being's life. I think that's really powerful. And that sometimes comes from the process of the journalism just as much as the eventual output. So yeah, I really like that piece of impact. And now I will let everybody talk about actually measuring impact, because I'm not going to do that at all, but I'm happy to talk about that at a later date. Yeah.
Great. Mary, may I ask you a question?
Sure.
Yeah. That was terrific and so useful. By the way, when you're talking about personal, one of the things we found in our studies for OSF is that conferences like this turned out to have a huge impact on people's lives. Because they come, they get new ideas, they make new friends, sometimes they get new funding. So actually, you know, at OSF we kind of wondered, do conferences make sense? And they really do. So I love your personal story. One question I just wanted to ask you was, when you talk about your audience, are you tailoring the coverage for them, or are you just more talking about delivering it to them? That is to say, do you think, okay, this MP really needs to know this kind of thing, or it's just we really want him to see, her to see it?
Yeah, absolutely. We would think about how to present the information in the most useful way. I mean, you know, the information will be the same. We're not kind of omitting facts, but we will present them in a specific way. So say, you know, we will get the key findings of the investigation into the form of a briefing and either deliver that, you know, in paper form to a politician, or we often, you know, we brief people in person, you know, because actually that can be way more effective. Journalism doesn't have to be a story on a page. Like, it's information, data, stories that can go out there into the world and interact with people in so many different ways. And, you know, it doesn't have to be confined to a page or a screen, and you might be able to inform someone, which is what we're all seeking to do, right? We want to inform people. Or you might inform them way more effectively by having a conversation with them and taking them through your findings, you know, and that's going to maybe be much more meaningful and useful to them. So
I think that's incredibly key. I mean, I'm writing these long academic papers. I brought a couple. And what I'm also doing is writing little blog posts or talking about it one-to-one, because that is such an important part of conveying. Often the article is almost the calling card or the starting point for getting the messages out.
You need to think about the needs of your audience, right? I sometimes think there's not another product in the world where you'd kind of be like, right, we're doing this product, so we think it's a good product, but we're not going to think about the people who are going to use it. We're not going to design it to be useful. We're not going to like think about their needs. It's like, let's like design it to be really useful and help people be able to use it. That's part of our job as well, I really think, if we want to genuinely serve the public interest.
Thank you. And I think we've got Wahyu next from Tempo in Indonesia.
Thank you, Anya. It was terrific, Miriam. I come from a different background compared to the Bureau. I come from a commercial, for-profit newsroom, so I probably can offer you a different perspective on measuring impact. How do commercial publishers see this particular initiative? I have my slides up. So this is something quite new as well for Tempo. I think we started to do this like in a more systematic way in the last 1 year. And that's also thanks to a GIJN seminar about this topic. And I think Anya was there as a speaker, and then also Lindsay was there. And then we start, you know, discussing this in the newsroom, and we believe this is something that we need to, you need to experiment it. So this is what we do. We try to experiment with measuring impact because we believe this is not only important to gain trust and to remind the public how relevant and important our work is, but it's also about the business side. There is a commercial and business proposition behind measuring impact. Because of course, this is just a glimpse of what Google search will give you in any day in Indonesia. Mostly will give you viral, celebrity news, sensational items, and most of the newsroom will try to do this kind of news because that's the most topics that can give you the most eyeballs and can give you traffic. But if we let this trend continues, then our work will lose its relevance to the public. So it's very important for independent publishers that, you know, keep producing high quality investigative reports to remind the public what's the impact that our work brought to the public, what changes that happen after our work is published. This is something that we not often do. This is something that we often left to leave it to the civil society group or other public interest group that react to our stories. But increasingly nowadays, this is something that I think we have to take on our own. So this is what that if we don't do this, then the whole news ecosystem will be moved to a different direction that is not going to pay high attention or don't really appreciate the kind of stories that we do. Of course, traffic is still important. Measuring your reach, your audience is still important, but it is not the only metrics that are matters. If you look at reach, page views, that is only one side of the picture. You need to go deeper and see what kind of audience that comes to your website. How long do they stay? How often do they return? How many pages do they visit once they come to your websites? And often in everyday conversation with reporters, with other publishers, the only metrics that comes to become the most priority is the eyeballs, the traffic. And we need to deliberately shift the conversation towards more in-depth and high-quality traffic, not only the eyeballs, but the engagement of these visitors to our website. So this is what we decided to do. We have to keep remind the public the impact of our work. That's how we come up to this decision to do this experiment. This is a couple of examples of the stories that make it to the editorial impact project that we did. The first story is so we did this last year in July. It's a 2 series of investigation into a big Islamic philanthropist group in Indonesia. They did a lot of charity project in Palestine, in Aceh, but we got some leaks that they have mismanaged a lot of fund, and there's of course documents and data to back up our investigation. It was a 4 months long investigation, and I think just a month after we published the story, the National Police started investigating these Islamic charities. The second story was about illegal nickel mining. This is also involving law enforcement agencies. As you know, Indonesia is currently pushing for nickel processing within the country. So the government banned all export of raw material, and it gives an opportunity for many illegal players to illegally mine this very precious material. And they get help from police, from government officials to make fake documents and open up mining in illegal areas. Again, after a couple of months, the Attorney General Office follow up our story, and then I think just last month, one high-profile DA was arrested in Sulawesi. This is the last part of the experiment. Is a story about social forests. So we deliberately choose stories that have actually follow up impact, and then we try to amplify those impacts and tell the stories to the public. A story that we published early this year. This is late last year. This is about social forest scheme. So when the government gave out concession to indigenous people to manage their own forests, but because of the complexity of the bureaucracy, sometimes brokers and makelers trying to provide illegal way for this indigenous community to get their concession, and also ask for fees to do that. After our story was published, several brokers also was arrested by the police. So these are the 3 stories that we decided to then amplify to the public because it has actual impact and actual changes happen after we published the story. But we didn't really, do something systematic to remind the public that this has happened because of our story. So the first thing that we do is try to define what is the impact that we want to show. We decided that any meaningful response can be included as an impact. Letters from readers, response from officials, law enforcement agency, invitation of a hearing with law enforcement agency should be sufficient enough to be considered as an impact. Then we create this small table. I think we also replicate this from one of the impact tracker platform. So we have 6 boxes. Does it win award? Does it get any policy changes? Do people realize, get more awareness, trigger more awareness from the public? Does it give like straight impact, direct impact? Does it help social movement? Does it get appreciation from people who get affected by the story and so on? So we have a list of these 6 boxes and see what kind of actual impact the story created. So after that we create several formats for the impact, an essay or an op-ed, and then podcast, carousel on Instagram, short video, and also thread on Twitter. So this is solely about the gatherings, the collection of data that we have based on the 6 impact boxes that I just explained. Then we use all the social media tools to push out these impact stories to the public. We also did discussion on Telegram groups. We have Telegram groups with our readers. In total, there's 12,000 people in all 11 groups in the Telegram that we have, and we have Twitter Space to do after we publish the story. Then the last part, after defining the impact and then creating the impact story and amplifying it, the last one is monitoring and evaluating the process to learn from what went wrong or also what went okay, and then trying to correct and make it better the next time we do it. So tracking how many people actually reacted and then how many people actually converted to become subscribers maybe afterwards is also something that we do. So this is the last part, the lesson learned from this process. First, I think in measuring impact is not only for non-profit media, it's also for commercial media. And this is something that we need to do as part of our contribution to create a better news ecosystem in our country, because if not, then the whole direction will be towards less in-depth and investigative news. The public need to be reminded what are the impact that we created for the public. So the 3 phases that we did for our experiment is define, publish, and amplify, and monitoring the process. At the end, we seek to strengthen our brand recognition, build more public trust and relevance, and also reach new and wider audience. But of course, this is still a process. We are experimenting with it. We learn from our mistake, and I'm looking forward for meaningful conversation with you. Thank you.
I have a couple questions for YU, if I may. That was so interesting. And my first question is, do the investigative stories get more traffic? Do they generate revenue? Do you know?
Yes, but we don't do it very often because we do it like every 2 months, 1 story per 2 months or 3 months. So we cannot really, rely on our newsroom to keep delivering the story once a week. But every time they come up with good investigative stories, usually we have higher traffic and better conversion rate.
Oh, that's great, because I'm thinking of Jay Hamilton's book, Democracy's Detectives, where he looked at U.S. case studies and found that, one investigative piece could take 6 months and cost $300,000. So even if you didn't get, quick revenue results, you at least improved the brand. But that's nice to know you get traffic. I had another question, but please come in, Miriam.
Well, I just wanted to say I think there is a really strong business case for impact, so both in terms of kind of, your audience, bringing value to their audience, they're going to stay with you, they're going to value you more, retain you, right? And obviously for funders, the more that you can show that you're delivering on their goals, which is what they want, the greater your chances of greater philanthropic funding. But on the kind of commercial return as well, there's a really interesting article published recently about the wider financial return for society, when companies are fined or when corruption is uncovered and, people, public money can then be better spent and so on, you can actually argue that, the money spent on investigative journalism, if we're invested publicly, will more than pay itself back into the public purse.
And Drew Sullivan had that whole proposal for creating a fund where journalists would get some of that money and we could use it for journalism. The other question, as you were talking, I was thinking about long-term and short-term, and I'm so glad you mentioned it. Obviously, in the foundation world, that's a thought as well, because we're often talking about long-term change. At OSF, our goal was to open societies long-term. When I think of Indonesia, I think of some stories that have been covered for decades. For example, palm oil. We've had incredible investigative reporting on palm oil for decades. Robin McDowell from AP just won a big award a couple of years ago. That problem is still not solved, even though the Girl Scouts in America banned palm oil from their cookies like 20 years ago. Another one is, I think of the great work on labor conditions on fishing boats. Very often that's Balinese, that's Indonesian sailors. Ben Skinner did the big piece for Bloomberg, and that had an impact because those ships were flagged to New Zealand, so New Zealand acted, right? It's that point of when you're targeting a government or an entity that will change, but there's been so many fishing, shrimp farming. Ian Urbina has an entire company, a nonprofit devoted to exposing labor conditions at sea. I don't know if you want to say another word about long versus short term.
Yeah, I think it's very rare when our story got this like immediate significant impact that, changed the whole thing overnight. In reality, it usually happens incrementally, so it takes one small steps at a time. And the point to keep producing those stories, keep hitting those topics, is actually to help build that momentum until that finally one day that significant change happen. In Indonesia, palm oil, for instance, we start seeing a more like a positive attitude towards this kind of campaign, more support for forest, keeping the forest intact, against converting it into palm oil plantation, and that not the case a few years back. So I think building that public awareness will take time, and that's why when I mentioned the defining impact thing, you have to really define what are the small changes that can be put out to the public, not only the big thing, but also the small things that happen.
I think you said something really significant. When Trump got elected, my friend Alexis McGill Johnson became president of Planned Parenthood. And, death threats, bodyguards, abortion rights being rolled back. And Alexis said something very inspiring. She said, we can't keep asking ourselves, why are we fighting these same battles over and over again? What we have to say is, not on my watch. And I think it's so inspiring what you're saying. We may have to do that palm oil story every 5 years, but that's what you're all doing, right? Not on my watch. Yeah, please, and then we'll go to Rosemary.
Yeah, like social change is not linear and it takes a really, really long time, but we can feed into it at like different steps along that way. That's the first thing I'd say. But yeah, staying on a story is one of the absolutely fundamental pillars of like trying to achieve impact. You might stay, the Bureau will do stuff for a year or sometimes years at a time, and you have to keep going back. Like, right. It's absolutely crucial. But then when it comes to corporate accountability, I also think it's a lesson for thinking really strategically about about the potential trigger points for change and like just where the journalism can be most useful. Like maybe just exposing this bad company's practices over and over again won't make that much difference to the company, but maybe exposing the finances that are bankrolling that institution from very respectable institutions that, you know, betray their public commitments. You know, so it's thinking, yeah, again, like what kind of journalism is going to be really useful in this space?
And solutions. Yeah. New York Times does a lot of stories about Swedish traffic, right? Because we're trying to copy that in New York. Rosemary, we don't want to eat up your time.
No,
please.
You don't even need me at this point, I think. I think this has been really great so far. Thank you all so much for coming to this session. I'm really happy that there's kind of a track devoted to impact here and that we can have a really kind of frank discussion about what all this means. I used to be a journalist. I now work for an organization called Impact Architects, and my perspective on this is going to be a little bit different, and I think maybe talk about how we can help folks get to where these folks are, right? Like how do you get to this level of where you're tracking impact, thinking about this work intentionally, and using that to leverage for better work within your organization, but also to secure funding, lots of things like that. So
this is dense material, so let's take it slow.
I'm sorry, yeah. I'm just really excited to be here, everybody. So I'm not sure if folks are familiar with Impact Architects, but we work with a variety of partners, with media organizations doing impact measurement and strategy, program evaluation, and we also work with philanthropic partners for strategic assessments as well. And I work directly with media organizations and our philanthropic partners to develop frameworks and tools to measure their impact and then report that out to various stakeholders. And so we do that mostly through a platform that we have, the IA Impact Tracker, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but want to maybe do a little bit of table setting as we get started here to think about how we define impact and maybe get into some specifics of how we've seen some folks execute this. So when we think about impact, it's core to our work, obviously, it's in the name, but a goal we have is really to reframe how folks are thinking about it, expand the notion around it, and so that impact can be anything that your organization deems important. And we define that as a change in the status quo that's the result of a direct intervention. That change is observable and it's measurable, and often specific impact looks different for everyone, right? If your organization is focused on investigations in a specific region or on a specific topic area like climate change or gender-based violence, whatever your specific organization might be focused on, your taxonomy around impact is going to be a little bit different and specific and unique to your values and to your audiences as well. I think impact has really largely relied on traditional advertising metrics over the past 20 years. These are really important things to know. Page views, time on site, these are all really important things. But that kind of quantitative data doesn't always tell the full story, right? It sometimes misses some nuance there. And we've worked with many, many news organizations over the years and have developed some broad categories of impact. We have 4 here that we kind of work in with our partners to start to look at the qualitative impact of media. And we see that as change happening at the institutional level. So who are power holders or people who hold power within your community, within your audiences, what change is happening at that level. At the network level or network change, how is community engagement building or expanding as a result of your work? As Miriam pointed out, are you giving folks enough information to act on in civil society groups or advocacy groups? How is your reporting spurring other change with other groups? Change that happens at the level of the audience or individual. And this is folks who are reading content or listening to a story, how they might be changing their opinion or have increased knowledge or changed behavior as the result of your work. And then finally thinking about media amplification and the role that plays. So how is your media being used by other media? Are you being cited? How is your data being used? And that's all important as we start to kind of think about impact holistically and think about this an ecosystem. So this is going to be a very scary model that we have up here, but we know that journalism plays an important role in facilitating change. It's not the only actor or the only thing, but it plays an important role in it. And so how do you capture that big picture? And we think that an ecosystem model really kind of reflects that complexity of the work, and also points out that this is not a hierarchical model, right? None of these categories that we talked about, these broad categories, is more important than another. As we just brought up as well, what you said, it's institutional change and institutional impact might not happen instantaneously. It might not happen at all, right? So having, accountability reporting and that type of institutional change happen as a result of your work is wonderful. But if you also start to think and expand your idea of impact around these other topic areas or these other categories, you'll see that your work is really influencing or really starting to facilitate change, or is an important reflection of your value in your community and the people that you're serving. And when you start to look at this over time, what patterns are starting to emerge from this? You might already realize that some of your work or some of your folks within your organization are already doing some of this work. It just might live in silos, right? If you're following social media comments to find those meaningful engagement with readers, if you are doing audience surveys with folks, if you are engaging in collaborations or partnerships, if you have stronger relationships with civil society groups, all of these things might exist within different spaces within your organization. Are folks talking? Is that centralized somehow? Do you have an understanding within your organization of what the big picture is? And that gets to, ultimately, what we're trying to aim for is getting folks to a culture of impact within their organization. That requires commitment and prioritization of the work. We see, again, some really great examples here. If you have questions about how to do this work, these are great people to talk to about that. You have to have a dedicated workflow around this and think about what are the best processes that work to make this work for you, right? What systems are you already using that you might be able to adapt to your purposes? Do you already use Slack? Are you already using that to keep in touch with folks? Do you have people dropping in examples of some of where this impact might exist? Could you create an impact Slack channel? Then you start to have a central place for this information to live. Does this live currently in 300 Excel documents? It might. So how do you start to centralize that information in one place? You don't have to reinvent the wheel or find new tools, which I'll talk about in a minute. You don't have to find brand new solutions to this. If you're already doing things that work, how might you be able to adapt it? And so especially if you're resource strapped. And finally, we have to think about when technology can help and when it can't help. I think a lot of folks want to jump straight to a tool and a dashboard, be able to press a button, and then all of their impact is tracked and communicated out to folks. They want a dashboard to be able to view. Full disclosure, I'm going to be talking about a dashboard in about 5 minutes that I think is helpful for folks. But there are many, many steps that you have to take before you can just jump into using a tool to do this work. Tools are most effective when you have the skills to wield them, right? So what is the strategy behind influencing the work itself? What tool complements your existing workflow and gets impact to the core of your work? And we know that impact is important because you can communicate this to a variety of stakeholders. We know that qualitative impact tracking is a lot easier now than it used to be, even 10 years ago. So a lot of this work is a little bit easier to do. But when you're communicating this out to stakeholders, why does this matter to them, right? And the first area we think is that impact is an exercise in trust with your audience, right? How might you demonstrate your impact to your audience, show your work, show your value with them, and how might you engage folks in that process? The next area is thinking about the efficiency of your organization and your workflows. How can this actually contribute and take loads off people's work at the end result, right? How might this also surface or resurface stories and trends that are emerging through impact tracking? So how do you keep your content relevant to and reflective of the communities that you're serving? We've seen, again, a couple examples of this happening. And finally, thinking about institutional support. This is probably the biggest incentive for folks who are getting involved in impact tracking is if a funder is asking you to do impact tracking for a grant, which probably a lot of folks here have experience with that. We know that grant reporting requires impact documentation, sponsorships require impact documentation, awards, even advertisers ask for this kind of information. Even your audiences might ask for some of this information. So how might you use this to help with existing grants or pursuing new funding? You can even kind of flip it a little bit and think about how you might use this work for individual giving campaigns or membership drives that you're doing, subscription services, and including people in that process. And I'll share a couple of examples of how we've seen some impact and action from some of the clients and partners we've worked with. And the most, I think, successful folks have common approaches to this. And they always start with defining impact and answering a few key questions as they get going. And the first is, what does success look like for you? What does that mean? What does impact mean to you? And then secondly, thinking about who your impact is for. What is the incentive to do this work? When you know who your impact is for, you also know what information they need, right? So you can start thinking about baking that into the process from the get-go, gathering that information as you're getting started. And then also thinking about what qualitative and quantitative data you can pull in. So how do you not just rely solely on traditional advertising metrics to tell your organization's story? And then finally, once you move through the definition process, which takes some time, developing an impact framework. And this broadly defines the categories of impact. I've given you an example of maybe 4 that you can use to start to conceptualize this, but you can adapt that, apply that to your organization and your goals. But ultimately, you want to be asking, what are the outcomes that I want to see from our work? And then what are the indicators that are going to tell you that you're getting there? That taxonomy of impact is essentially how you're measuring societal change or reform that your journalism has spurred. And an example from one of our partners, some key questions that they asked was our story the basis for legislation? Did it reach a national audience? Did it catalyze any action within our community? Already from those 3 questions, you can start to think about different data sources that would tell you if you're getting there, right? Did it reach a national audience? One, you can use your Google Analytics to see who's looking at your content, but you can also say our partnerships or republication efforts that we have also count as impact here because our work is being cited in other places. Catalyzing any action within the community could mean now we're going to be following up on this story with a direct survey, and we're going to be asking the same 5 questions of audience members at the next 3 events that we're holding or at the next spaces that we're in. Another example we've seen from our partners, they determine this around 4 key actors, right? So readers, officials, communities, and clients or partners. So really answering that question, who is our impact for? Why are we doing this, and what do they need? They pull in both qualitative and quantitative data, incorporating things like Parsley and Google Analytics into a dashboard, and then also incorporating their qualitative data into a simple Google form. They record payments from clients, from advertising partners, from readers, from grant funding. So they really have a holistic kind of approach of impact that also includes their organizational goals. So impact also means impact for them and their sustainability and growth overall. And finally, they built a culture of impact there. They have a dedicated person whose job it is to keep impact front of mind. They have essentially an impact editor. This is a really important and helpful process as you're getting started. We have a couple other folks who are focused on impact in the room here, so you can ask them questions on how that works. But they also keep folks focused on what impact means and help make sure that people understand what those definitions of impact are for your organization. If you have a question, does this count as impact? You have somebody to go to ask that question. And so we saw a need at Impact Architects to find a way to help centralize a lot of this information that might exist in silos in newsrooms. There are a lot of great examples of how people are approaching this work, creating central databases through platforms like Airtable or Salesforce. And where we saw a need was also for a technical tool that connects to your impact approach, to your framework, how you're addressing and identifying impact in your organization. So we developed the IA Impact Tracker as a way to kind of help folks get on this process. It's originally launched at the Center for Investigative Reporting about a decade ago, I think. And it is a free digital platform to help various actors understand the impact of their journalism, and particularly that qualitative data that can get lost. The input process for this, I'll let folks take a picture here. Also, just want to say that all of the slides and the tip sheet for this session will be included, so you'll be able to access all of this later. I'm going to throw a lot of things on the board. So it uses a simple Google form for folks to input that qualitative data, and then a spreadsheet where that data lives, and then a dashboard where that information is visualized. There are other data inputs that you can use, things like Google Analytics, or pull in CSV files from audience surveys or from media monitoring platforms like Meltwater, but the end result is an interactive and visual data set that can be downloaded as a PDF or shared out with different stakeholders. And you can really slice and dice this data in different ways so that you can tell relevant stories to those folks. And again, it's a platform that folks can customize to their specific taxonomies and workflows within your organization. So hopefully complementing that process of building a culture of impact. We've developed a free template that anybody can use. Anybody can copy this, adopt it. Anybody can adopt it and customize it to their organization's taxonomy, and then yield a visual and qualitative data set. This work, again, originally began at CIR with my company's founder, Lindsay Green Barber, but we acquired this tool in 2022 and sunset that version and have launched this Google-based version earlier this year. And the improvements we made really allow for folks to own the process. They own then their account, and they don't need a coding background to be able to use it, which is pretty helpful. And then, again, think through workflows of how to approach the work. And again, it's really most effective, getting back to that question of when can technology help and when can't it, it's most effective when you have a framework that has really clear and relevant indicators to put it all together. This is useful for organizations as a starting point and who are interested in trying to find ways to quantify that qualitative information. You can go beyond a little bit of the digital advertising metrics that we mentioned before. It is one of many tools that exist in the world right now. Impact is really having a moment, which is great. I would encourage folks, if Google is not your thing, you're not interested in a platform that does that, Resolve Philly has a really great impact tracker platform that you can also copy that's based in Airtable. I'd suggest folks take a look at that as well. I'm happy to also follow up if people have questions. And Solutions Journalism Network has a specific approach on impact tracking. They're doing really great work in this space, so another group to look out for. And so it doesn't have to be with what we do. You can try it with other folks as well. So ultimately what we see is impact tracking is really a three-pronged process here. And the first is defining impact. This takes the most amount of time, right? Asking these key questions and setting goals for your work. As two great examples we saw here again. What is the change that you want to see as the result of your work? And how do you incorporate impact in the process from the get-go? The second step is then building out a tool or way to measure that, and you can find lots of different ways to do it. It can just live in an Excel document. It doesn't have to live in a dashboard if that's not useful. And then finally, the act of impact tracking. What insights can be yielded from the work that you're doing? How is this process going to be in a distributed process within your organization? Is it going to fall to one person? How are you going to manage that workflow and make this a sustainable enterprise for folks? Have a lot of resources for folks on our website. This is all also included in the tip sheet there, but we have a blog with lots of testimonials and examples of how folks have used this approach. We have a way for you to download the tool and copy and adapt it for your work. I also have regular office hours every Tuesday. You can schedule 30 minutes to meet with me to either talk about this tool that we have or just talk about impact in general. If you want to talk through issues or challenges you're having, the link to that is, you can find it on our website, or it's also included directly in the tip sheet. So happy to do that. That is open to anyone. So please, if you're interested in kind of growing this community or being part of it, you're welcome to schedule time. I know that we're also trying to build a really kind of large community of folks and network around impact, and you're looking at one person who's been like absolutely amazing and integral in that part. Miriam has been really amazing in putting this type of group of folks together. That's a very welcoming space. More folks would always be great to talk about this work and hopefully have sessions at conferences like this going forward that can really dig into the nitty-gritty around impact and ways to measure it, tools to adopt. So we hope to see something like that maybe grow in the future. So I will stop now because I've been going on and on, but if you have questions, happy to talk.
Fantastic. Rosemary, that's so useful, and I'm sure everybody in the room, maybe you've heard of impact architects. They're really the gold standard. Whenever you say impact, everyone says, call Lindsay. So a couple things. One is, just yesterday I had to leave the meeting because I wrote a report on impact for my university, and we had a Zoom with all the faculty. So I was in exactly that position, and I loved what you said about make use of the material that's there. I'm trying to persuade our dean not to start like a whole new survey thing, but to already make use of what's reporting. And I bet your clients really appreciate that. Do you feel like people have a lot of stuff they can already use?
Yes, yeah, I think we definitely come across that. Particularly, we run workshops with folks to kind of surface what impact means, how the folks can define it. And what we see is that people really often have a lot of examples of things. They just hadn't really thought about impact in that way or changed their mindset or framework around what impact can mean. So it is probably likely that folks are doing a lot of this work, but if you can centralize it, streamline that process, it can contribute to your overall goals and even your sustainability, I think.
Yeah, and I thought your point, I do that too, like look at other people's websites. And for me to add, I thought the suggestions you made were so helpful. I really like the ICIJ website, which you've worked a lot on, and Lindsay has worked with for years, how they measure impact, and then ProPublica too does a lot of great stuff. And then I just had one question, and then I'm going to talk about the other work I've been doing with Lindsay, if that's okay, which is, I think, and this is something I'm sort of struggling with, these metrics that we're all using, to what extent can they be sort of standardized, or do you feel that each, okay, Miriam's already got a view, is each outlet different? Is this a Tolstoy situation, or in fact, do we all have a lot in common here?
I would say like, ultimately, yeah, folks have a lot in common. And again, coming up with really broad categories so that your framework can be flexible as your organization shifts and changes is really important, right? So we have some maybe broad categories that apply to most organizations, but those specifics really are unique to you. They're unique to your values, unique to the type of work that you do. Investigative journalism also just talked about this. It takes a long time. These impacts might not be happening immediately. So how do you keep this fresh and keep this as a process that can extend long periods of time? So while there might be some common themes, I don't know that adopting maybe like the standard suite of things is the best approach. But I know you also have.
Yeah, I just say you're having metrics to measure success against your goals, right? So to say that every organization might have a standard set of metrics, it's like saying that every organization is going to have the same strategy. That's what it's ultimately got to come back to. Like, who are we here for? What are we here for? What are we trying to do? What are we trying to achieve? And you build metrics to match that. You have to think that's why the defining part is so important. You can't start measuring stuff and developing metrics unless you've got really, really clear and aligned vision as an organization for what you want to do. And there's many different journalism organizations with aiming to do many, many different things for many different audiences, so they will all need to have their individual metrics to define their own success.
I would say, though, I think maybe in the funding space, what might be interesting is if funders would maybe talk a little more and collaborate around the specific questions and things that folks are asking. Hi, Josh. And think through maybe if there's some common questions or common metrics that everybody can be asking, so that at least when folks and grantees are doing this data collection, this impact tracking, maybe they're all collecting similar data that can be shared, but then have the ability to adapt that and tweak that so that it can be unique to each funder or each program or each organization.
Rosemary, that's great advice, and I feel like we've all been begging funders for years. I want to give Wahyu a chance to come in, but I was wondering if my slides made it, because I had two. If not, it doesn't matter. Go ahead. Did you have a comment, Wahyu? Did you want to come in? You don't have to.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with what this guy said, that every organization, every newsroom has their own metrics, their own goals, and it's your decision at the end of the day to define what kind of impact you want to achieve. I think that's the most important thing.
Right. And I just wanted to talk about the new research I've been doing with Lindsay, and then open it up to questions. So Impact Architects has worked a lot with ICIJ, and they came to us and asked us if we could do a cost-benefit analysis of investigative journalism. Because since Jay Hamilton's book came out, everybody's wondering if it's possible. So I talked to a lot of economists, and they said absolutely not. It's completely impossible. And I'll give you one example. Let's say you've got 25 African journalists working on an expose about, the extractive sector or tax avoidance. In fact, and they, as you pointed out, Miriam, they discover $5 million of fraud or something. Those African journalists are paid so little that it skews completely your numbers, because then it looks like, it was an artificially cheap investigation. So there's all kinds of things where you really just can't put a number. And, UNESCO's asked me over the years to try to do that. But so we told the ICIJ, don't go down that route. You know, they wanted to be able to say to funders, hey, you've given us $100,000, and we've exposed, you know, $20 million of fraud. But what Lindsay and I did with 3 other co-authors during the pandemic was we went out and read everything on impact, as I mentioned, economics, political science, other journalism, other taxonomies, the impact architect work, and then we made a new matrix with 80 measurements. You can tell it's a pandemic project. We got carried away. Lindsay and I spoke every single week on the phone. I'm not sure I've ever even met her in person. And we came up with this enormous taxonomy. And we also looked at the benefits to the profession. So when journalists do collaborative investigations, do they get promoted? Do they get hired away? Is there more traffic? As well as all these institutional and social. And then we designed a survey based on all these points in the taxonomy. And the idea was that if you, it's a bit really what you're, you know, a bit what you've done, but a slightly more elaborate, that if you want to measure one thing, like the effect on the network, or the effect on the individual, or the effect on society, you could just take like one column of the matrix. And we wrote these questions. Anyway, the paper came out last week in the Applied Journalism Media Studies Journal. I've got copies if anybody wants it with all our whole matrix. And now Lindsay and I, ICIJ sent out the questionnaire, and we've got the data, and Lindsay and I are doing a second paper that actually looks at that. And we may find out our taxonomy got too elaborate, and so elaborate that it's, you know, maybe not useful for day-to-day people, but I just wanted to say I've got copies if anyone's interested.